This is Bruce.
And this is Ashlyn.
Thanks for joining the Life Report.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. The topic of racism is not just a headline from the past few weeks, but it's a recurring problem in today's culture, and we want to address and unpack its effects on the abortion industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of set this up for where we're headed, this is actually going to be a two-part series where we talk about racism and its impact on abortion. And then in our next session or next episode, we'll talk about the racial influence on foster care and adoption, as that really is the scope of our work with Life Initiative and Family Restoration at Watermark. And so I want to start just by acknowledging, and I know that this can kind of put people off from the get-go, but race as a general idea is a construct of society, right? Is like, it really is just the distance that melanin has in your skin to the surface. And yet it's become a very real thing in how we categorize ourselves and how we categorize others. And so biblically speaking, there's not a ton of support for the idea of race. There's a ton of support for things like ethnicity and tribes and cultures and languages. And so we don't want to dismiss that. And yet at the same time, I recognize by even saying that, there are some that just kind of get turned off and go, look, if you're not going to acknowledge race, then why are you even mentioning anything? So what we're not saying is that racism doesn't exist. And so when we look at the Bible as a lens and a framework and the worldview for everything that we do, we have to kick back to Genesis 1:26-28, where God makes mankind in his image, that we are image bearers, and that is why we have value. That is what gives us worth. It's what sets us apart from the rest of creation. And so there's no sort of pecking order within mankind, but we've definitely in our sinfulness established that. And so what we find, even in the midst of this kind of cycle of sinfulness and God going, hey, that's not going to work out for you. Like, I want to come alongside and restore and help you. That what God does is he says, look, I'm a God of justice. I'm a God of righteousness. And so I'm going to pursue that with you and encourage you to pursue it as well. I think one of my favorite passages is Micah 6:8 that just says that we are to seek justice, not just prefer it, not just, kind of whenever it works for us, but to actually seek it out. And to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. And so I want to make sure that as we start to talk about racism, especially as it relates to abortion, that we have the foundation of Scripture there established, and then we move forward as we seek justice. Ashlyn and I also recognize we're both white people. And what we didn't want to do was reach out to a Black friend and say, hey, would you come validate us and give us a voice or a platform to kind of come alongside you to talk about abortion and talk about racism in the same breath. And so as white people, as leaders of this ministry, we just want to kind of hold our hand up and say, hey, we have some things that we've learned. We want to encourage our white friends, our Black friends, our friends of color, if you will, and just engage in this conversation, and then certainly be open for conversation moving forward. So if we say something that you just go, hey, here's a better way of thinking about that, or here's a better way of saying that, or I didn't know that, thank you for sharing. We would love to have you comment, whether you're watching on YouTube or on one of the social media channels.
Yeah, for sure. So that being said, how many of you have actually considered the statistics around the racial divide in abortion? Back in 1973, when Roe v. Wade was passed, it was actually found through national polling that African Americans were more likely to oppose the idea of abortion than their white counterparts. And even though the abortion statistics have decreased in recent years nationwide, a Black woman on every range of the economic scale is still more likely to seek out an abortion than white women. And to put that into perspective really fast, Black women actually make up about 14% of the childbearing population, but 36% of abortions. That's more than double the representation in the national population. 14% to 36%. That's huge. Another way of looking at that is in the 60 million abortions that have taken place since Roe v. Wade, 26.1 million have been African American children. And I know the statistics can get really long-winded. They can tire you out pretty quickly if you delve in too far, but the numbers don't lie. And we really want to unpack that today and just look at the history and look at the structure of today's culture and figure out why it is on average that Black women and women of other colors are more likely to seek out abortions.
Yeah, and so there's some guys who do a podcast called Just Thinking that I think has some really poignant concepts, ideas around this topic. They did a session on abortion. And so we'd encourage you to go kind of check that out. There's lots of good stuff out there. Some of the content that we're going to share today comes from a documentary that's like 2.5 hours long called Ma'afa 21. You can watch it on YouTube for free. And yeah, just sort of pull the blinders off and help you see how systemically here in America specifically, we have targeted the Black population for abortion, and it's tragic. So there's lots of great stuff out there. Our friends with Live Action have lots of good resources that we've benefited from. Certainly our friends that serve in the pregnancy resource world and pregnancy center world with Human Coalition and Thrive and The Source and Prestonwood Pregnancy Center, which are all kind of around Watermark here in Dallas. We'd love to encourage you to connect with them. But let's kind of unpack maybe how we got here and where this started.
You mentioned that the abortion industry has been targeting the African-American population. And what is the history behind that, Bruce? Like, why is it today that the average abortion client, per se, is that singles, 20-something-year-old African-American woman who typically already has one child at home? Where did we start? How did we get here?
So unlike foster care, which I mentioned we'll talk about next time, abortion actually started as a racist agenda. And certainly it's, the racial aspect of this goes, and the injustice of this goes back even to the African continent, where you had, Africans selling other Africans into slavery and shipping them across. And you had, both white and African slave owners here in America. But abortion really, and the idea behind abortion really takes off at the end of slavery. So you have the end of the Civil War, which prior to that, I mean, you had white slave owners who were trying to reproduce more African Americans, more Black people, so that they had more slaves to work their plantations and work the fields. And yet at the end of slavery, as all of these slaves are now free, you have this, both the North and the South going, crud. Like, what are we going to do with all these people that now have equal rights as we do? And so, yes, you have the Ku Klux Klan, which is incredibly violent and intimidating. I mean, you have tragic events like the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. But in the late 1800s, a guy named Francis Galton becomes the father of what is known as eugenics. And eugenics was really just a connection and a logical kind of downstream thought from the theory of evolution. Galton was actually a cousin to Charles Darwin. And so Galton comes up with this eugenics philosophy that effectively says, look, there are good genes we want to promote. That's where the word eugenics comes from, good genes. And he just takes it and kind of goes, well, what are the good genes we want to promote and what are the bad genes we want to get rid of? Sort of this survival of the fittest mentality. And of course, this white European guy is going to look at those that are inferior and who are considered unfit, or those with mental health issues, those who are criminal, those who are in poverty, and go, well, they're less than. Like, the reason that they're less than isn't maybe some chance or some choice that their parents made or whatever. The reason that they're poor, or the reason that they're mentally disabled or physically disabled or whatever it might be, is because their genes aren't as good. And so they then track that into what is a really sadistic kind of mindset that really carried its way through the Holocaust and into really about the 1970s, 1980s, until it started to die down in regards to its effectiveness or its popularity with the last state that practiced forced sterilization. Now, that's not to say that it's not still alive and well today. I think there are people today that still echo the eugenics mentality. I know I've heard Bill and Melinda Gates kind of share something along those lines, although they don't use that kind of trigger word of eugenics anymore. But there are people that are still kind of echoing this sentiment. I mean, Planned Parenthood today is saying things like it, but Margaret Sanger comes along in kind of the early 1900s. She founds I believe it was called the Birth Control League of America or something initially, and then they changed the name to Planned Parenthood later. But she founds this movement, really recognizing that that you've got these poor women who are having all these kids that they can't provide for, and they're becoming this dependent population throughout the United States. And her solution is, let's get these women on birth control to prevent them from having kids, and let's practice forced sterilization. So let's sterilize those women to keep them from ever being able to even have kids. That actually entered law, which is crazy to me, that states were just going, look, if you can't provide for your kids, then we're forcefully sterilizing you. Like, giving the government that kind of power got scary. And there's some stories of like women who were raped, and they went, look, you can't provide for your child, or you got raped, and now we're gonna sterilize you. Just nuts. But Margaret actually gets together funds in, I believe it was in like the mid 1940s, and begins to invent the contraceptive pill. I mean, it's believed to be this amazing feat of invention and technology. And yet the guy that she worked with and the donors that they worked with in order to make that all go started up in Massachusetts with women to have them start to take, and originally it was like 10 times the dosage of hormones that a woman actually needs to get pregnant, or to keep from getting pregnant. And the women eventually just went, we cannot take this anymore. Whatever it is you're giving us, we can't take it because it is making us sick. They realized how toxic it was to them. And so what Margaret and kind of this group that invented the contraceptive pill did is they went to Puerto Rico to a population that they wanted to reduce. And they exploited that opportunity where there was less regulation, and so less people protecting the health and well-being of those women. And they invented the contraceptive pill. And, since then, they have kind of just been continuing to misrepresent what hormonal birth control is, in that it is an abortifacient, not necessarily just keeping a woman from getting pregnant. And so that was really one of the big ones for me that I learned, is I just kind of turned around and went, God, that is really misrepresenting this whole idea that we've come to embrace today, where Planned Parenthood is supposed to be about women's health care and women's reproductive rights and this sort of freedom, when it was really about exploitation and this eugenics philosophy. And where I think that is maybe most poignant is after Margaret Sanger dies in like the mid 1960s, a guy named Alan Guttmacher, who is an OB-GYN, becomes the second president of Planned Parenthood. And the second president of Planned Parenthood, he was the vice president of the American Eugenics Society. And it was under his leadership that they started to bring on sort of Black spokespeople to validate what they were doing, as they started putting Planned Parenthoods into Black communities, into minority communities, and targeting those from the very get-go. They even awarded Martin Luther King Jr. with the Margaret Sanger Award there in the late 1960s. He was one of the original recipients of it. His wife came and kind of received it in his place. And in some ways, sort of the words that she shares in that speech of, we want to promote healthy Black families, are just misleading, right? To say that maybe she didn't fully understand what was happening, because some of the original people who were rejecting Planned Parenthood's movement into these minority communities were the Catholics and the Black Panthers. You had politicians like Jesse Jackson, even before his presidential campaign, that opposed abortion and saw what was happening. And so that's a little bit of the history. Obviously, 1973, Roe v. Wade is passed, and effectively the eugenics agenda gets to step back because they've accomplished what they wanted to accomplish through kind of second wave feminism, where they convinced a lady named Betty Friedan, who led the National Organization for Women, into believing that in order for women to experience equality, they had to have abortion. They had to be able to end the lives of their preborn children. And, not only is that tragic, but I think it definitely communicates sort of, or is a perfect example of what we often do as sinful human beings, where we just kind of pass the buck down to the most exploitable population. And so, what is and has been abortion pointed at African Americans, at people of color, at those who are minorities, at those who are deemed unfit and expendable, is now down to, the most voiceless, vulnerable population we have, and that's the preborn. And most often, as you mentioned, the average abortion client is a Black woman who already has one child and is single parenting. And so, man, that's some of the dark history of what's going on in and with abortion and racism.
And that feeds into definitely the influence on the abortion industry today. I mean, I'm a mom, so I know the challenges and the blessings that come with being pregnant and having kids. I have a 3-year-old son who drives me crazy some days, and a 16-month-old daughter. It's hard to keep track anymore.
Right.
Through them, and I feel like everything in my life now is about kids, which can be a blessing and a curse. But I do occasionally get out and about in society still, and I guess both through my children and through my other interactions, I don't see this overt racism present like everywhere. It's not at the grocery store that I see. Now, that's not to say it's not some places, but what I do see is an underlying bias of racism that the system has perpetuated, because as you just mentioned, that's what the system is built upon. That's our foundation from slavery forward. That is our foundation. And even though the people today aren't responsible for what people did in the past, we also haven't completely knocked down the system and started over. You can't at this point. So you have to keep going with what you have. So I don't see the overt racism in the general public. I do see a very strong line of racism in the abortion industry. And that even goes as far as to say some people who are just willingly ignorant, as if to say that they can't or they won't be a part of the solution. So not seeing racism. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in. So I think one of the things that points that out to me is you kind of said like, hey, it's sort of this foundation that's been built upon. And I think we were thinking, when we talk about foundation, we're thinking, culturally, and so on and so forth, but physically as well, right? Is like 79% of Planned Parenthood facilities are located within walking distance of minority communities. And so, it's not like Planned Parenthood is going, hey, we're not about abortion. We're about healthy, pregnant women of all ethnicities, of all races, being able to deliver and parent their child and promoting. And so like what's happened is sort of hey, we want to promote white women to have healthy pregnancies, and Black women, we want to discourage you from having healthy pregnancies at all. Like that seems to be kind of Planned Parenthood's underlying message in this. So like they're not fighting for healthy pregnancies. They're fighting for Black women don't have babies at all. Right.
Right.
And so, those facilities being in those communities is not an accident. Like somebody strategically thought this is where we want those.
Right. To maximize their profits. They're a company just like any other company. They're trying to maximize their profits. And that's how you decide where to open a facility. On their website, even in a very craftily typed text, they explain that they wish that women could abort children based on race. They think that shouldn't be illegal. They want to reopen that discussion nationwide. And that's, horrifying. Like you said, it just goes back to the racism of it all. And I think one of the best examples of this is New York State. In 2017, there were 252 different facilities equipped to provide abortions in New York State. It shouldn't come as a surprise at all that for the past few years in New York City alone, more Black children were aborted than born.
Yeah, that is like that. Not only I hope you heard that, like let that sink in. So not only does that grieve me, but I got to experience that in like a real visceral way. I went to a lunch with Council for Life, which is here in Dallas. They do a lot of good work in just raising money for the different efforts that go on across Dallas and in the pro-life community. And Nicole Mullins was there. It's kind of a famous Christian singer who just has this incredible voice. And as she started to share her story of unexpected pregnancy and some other things, she shared that statistic. And as she shared it, there was an elderly Black woman sitting a few tables in front of me who just began to weep loudly and shake in her grief. And there was not a dry eye in the room, as I think we all just recognized that this elderly Black woman had kind of looked and heard and just gone, look, they've accomplished what they set out to do. Like it is a genocide against the Black community that Planned Parenthood is not just trying to accomplish, they've accomplished it. And if you're kind of sitting back and going, gosh, I just don't know what to do about racism. I don't know how to help. I'm not racist, but you're probably also not anti-racist either. That there is a very real opportunity to go, you know what, I want to be a part of the solution. I want to see things move forward, not just for the people in my community, but for people everywhere, for women everywhere. Man, it just grieved me. And like that sound, man, will just forever be in the back of my head as I think about, okay, well, what else can we do? How else can we move forward?
And this racism thread isn't just in the abortion side of things. It feeds into other areas of healthcare as well. And people today aren't at fault for that, but we're also not, like you said, being anti-racist about it. We're not taking a step back to reevaluate. We're actually adding on top of it, almost as if there's this clamp on society and everything in the middle is just under a lot of pressure. And we can only see the economic dysfunction, the fatherlessness, the drug abuse, everything on that surface level, but we don't take into consideration all the layers underneath that have made that a reality.
Yeah, I think that's been eye-opening for me, kind of that perspective that you just shared of like, I'm kind of that top clamp, right? That is going, gosh, like, why are you responding this way? Why don't you value, marriage? Why don't you value sort of this nuclear family idea that I value? And I've had some friends even lately with sort of the Black Lives Matter stuff where I've read some of their things, just gone, look, I just don't think this is helpful. I don't think this is the way forward. And they're like, well, that's because family was promoted for you. Marriage was promoted for you. Childbirth was promoted for you. Whereas, for much of the Black community, for, much of the decades prior to my life and even during my life, is there were policies put in place. There were things like redlining that were done. Even the welfare state and policies related to that were built to, impact the Black community, the minority community. And some of that was well-intentioned. I'm not saying that every single policy that ever came to bear was, meant to hold down people or oppress or exploit people. But certainly we've seen the results of those policies and how that's impacted those people. And so it's not that there aren't well-meaning people out there. It's just oftentimes that some of the conclusions we come to, myself included, right? Like I come to conclusions that aren't helpful conclusions and think like that's the way forward. And so we've got to do a good job of listening. We've got to do a good job of being engaged and not just kind of sitting back either in silence or in sort of that well-intentionedness so that we can see some of the implications as we kind of get outside of that clamp idea. And recognize some of the things we've done have created some of the problems and perpetuated or exasperated some of the problems that have taken place.
Yeah, for sure. Another example of those problems taking place in the healthcare industry is like the pregnancy-related mortality rate in both pregnant women and infants, like is so disproportionately higher in African-American women. Back in 2018 alone, it was 50% higher in Black women than white women. That's such a crazy discrepancy. I mean, why is that? I know from 98 to 2005, African-American women had 3 to 4 times higher risk of pregnancy-related death at every age interval compared with women of other races. And this increased risk of mortality also means that they're less likely to be receiving the prenatal care that both they and their baby need. It puts them at a higher risk for things like hypertension, and they just don't get that quality care and service that white women are getting.
Yeah. I mean, we see, so that clamp we were talking about, sort of that result is lots of women in general, aren't really taught about their bodies, right? And so like what they should experience, what they should feel during pregnancy, during labor and delivery. But for those that are in these marginalized communities, if you will, you have women who don't have access to prenatal care, don't have access to sex education, don't have access to health ed. And so, but what they do carry is, again, sort of this bias of you got pregnant because you were promiscuous. You didn't get prenatal care because you're a drug addict and you spent your money on drugs instead of on, prenatal vitamins. You didn't take the time to go find an OB-GYN, and now you're walking into Parkland Hospital, in labor. And a doctor's going, okay, well, let's wheel you in here. Let's get you, through this. And a woman starts to feel weird, but maybe she doesn't know that she has a voice to say something. She doesn't feel empowered. Whereas like my wife would go, no, something's off. And I'm demanding better health care. I'm demanding that somebody look into this. Whereas, somebody who has kind of historically been either promoted as a victim or been victimized, is then sort of said, well, just whatever happens, you're just going to grin and bear it, right? And so doctors and nurses do tend to have that kind of racial bias that, again, is not something they just woke up with one day, but it's something that they're kind of considering everything that's inside that clamp, right, that we talked about, and they find themselves at the top going, I mean, yeah, I could do something about it. I'm just biased in this way, and so I don't step in. Or I don't educate, and she's in the middle of labor delivery. So what am I going to educate her with anyway? But there's a lack of resource there. And I think that's one of the ways that we certainly could step in and just kind of see ourselves is, how do we help on that side of things? Like, how do we make sure that there is proper education? I know a lot of us are kind of anti-sex education in schools. And I've joined our school health advisory committee. Every school district has one where I get to go in and be a part of the solution to say, this is what kids need to know about their bodies. This is what kids need to know about sex and when. And this is how we need to prepare them and then prepare parents as well, right, to have those conversations with their kids. And so the discrepancies shouldn't exist, right? It just feels like we're just kind of turning a blind eye and going, no, look, this doesn't happen, and it's happening, right? It's happening in our communities. It's happening and has happened, and we have an opportunity to step in and be a part of, again, seeking justice. So on top of being a part of the solution in your school, getting into your community, and the resources that are available there. Maybe knowing who the midwives and the OB-GYNs are that can help provide some of that care, your hospitals, your local clinics, and then obviously educating people at your church and being a part of the solution there. Maybe Ashlyn, expound upon what it would look like for anybody who's watching to come alongside a woman or a man who's a part of an unexpected pregnancy.
The Life Initiative has a great mentoring program. I'll start by saying if you're interested, you can email pregnant@watermark.org to get even more information. But there's such a huge need here in the DFW area, especially with a lot of immigrant women who come in and they find themselves pregnant. And there's this whole stigma and stereotype about them being afraid to reach out and seek for help because they don't want to be deported. That's their immediate concern. So they don't even go get the prenatal care that they need for a healthy pregnancy because they definitely don't want to have to leave at the end of that. And there's part of us that want to hold up the law, obviously, and respect the law, but we can also meet those women where they are and help them along with any of the other women and men who find themselves facing an unexpected pregnancy.
Yeah, we definitely want to go upstream and, not just wait until a woman's had an abortion to begin caring for her, or not wait until a woman's delivering and it's like, oh, hey, now we're going to scramble and, promote adoption as kind of your only option. Obviously, we're huge fans of adoption, but ultimately we're huge fans of parents parenting their kids and being empowered and cared for. And so, I mean, we realize this has been a lot. You may be learning more every passing day. I know I learned something about Juneteenth just the other day that was just blew my mind. And there are those that are just waking up. Sort of, you've been saying, I'm colorblind in the past. And look, that's a terrible concept. I've got kids that have been adopted that are just like, no, look, my skin's darker than yours. It's okay. And then there's those of us who, are here who've been saying things like, where have you been? Like, how are you missing this? How are you just now, getting informed and getting involved? But welcome. Come join us. Like, we need one another in this. We need people bought in. Not just echoing, white privilege sentiments, but actually doing something about it, because awareness is not enough. It's just not enough.
So ultimately, we want to be a part of that solution and not the problem. If you want to contact us, if you have any questions or concerns about something you heard today, or like Bruce said at the beginning, if we got something totally wrong and you want to help continue to keep educating us, please reach out to us at the Life Initiative at watermark.org. We would love to engage a conversation with you. Thank you guys so much for tuning in.